It's like I'm nothing. I feel like just that simple. I feel like I'm nothing.
Why would Andy Schofield, a fourth-generation deaf person, feel that way? He says it's because of what happened when he and his 3 children took their deaf dog Glacier for a walk. The children's mother was also deaf, but all 3 kids can hear.
I was very excited because I felt like we were going to go out on a family walk, go out, walk our dogs together.
While walking down the street, the family says a black dog came running towards them. They were worried Glacier and the unleashed dog might fight.
I see a black lab coming up, so I hold the dog a lot more tighter, and I told my sister to get my dad.
The kids get Andy's attention as they see 2 women and a man running towards them.
And I just was pointing to the dog and saying, he needs to have a leash. He needs to have a leash on, this dog.
According to Andy and his kids, the black lab's owner initiated a fight.
He tried to throw a punch at my dad. He kind of fell down. My dad thought it was a good opportunity, so he got on top of him, saying, I don't want to fight, I don't want to fight.
So I just showed him, I put my hands in the air and said, don't want to fight, I don't want to fight. And when I went to go look away, I was obviously concerned about my kids and the dog, turned back and he punched me right in the nose.
Andy was bleeding profusely. It was all over his clothes. The family called 911.
I was telling the ambulance that I wanted an interpreter, and they said, you need to wait until the police show up. I said, okay, fine, I'll wait.
When a Precinct 4 deputy constable showed up, the deaf father says he repeatedly asked for an interpreter.
He really needed an interpreter. He asked the cop multiple times, I need an interpreter. He's like, okay. He kept saying that. Okay, we'll get you one.
I was sitting in the ambulance, bleeding still. The police officer walked around, and I tried to explain, and he was not listening to anything that I had to say.
Andy and the Precinct 4 constable's office agree on one thing. The officer used Andy's 13-year-old son as an interpreter.
I was trying to explain to him, my son is 13 years old. He can't interpret. So I told him, I need an interpreter.
Andy says the deputy constable took a statement from the other man who said Andy initiated the fight, not him.
I kept telling him, interpreter, I need an interpreter, this is the sign. I said it repeatedly.
Instead of getting Andy an interpreter, the deputy constable left. He took no pictures, collected no evidence, and didn't even bother to file a report. For that, Precinct 4 Chief Mark Herman says the deputy constable will be disciplined. But the chief insists using Andy's 13-year-old son to interpret meets Department of Justice guidelines.
And using family and friends is a common practice, but that's a no-no.
Deetra Stewart is a communication compliance specialist.
If you look at the legal definition, federal definition, family members and friends would immediately be disqualified because you cannot remain impartial.
When a neighbor who works in law enforcement heard about Andy's plight, he complained to Precinct 4. So the next day, another deputy constable shows up.
Sir, I asked for an interpreter, and they said, oh, no, we're just taking pictures. You don't need one.
Andy says it was nothing more than a replay of the day before. The officer used the deaf man's 13-year-old son to interpret, then took a statement from the other dog owner who said Andy started the fight, not him. The constable's office told us and Andy the DA's office refused to file charges, calling it a case of mutual combat.
I tried to tell them, how can you reject it without even hearing anything that I had to say?
Andy says he also asked the DA's office for an interpreter, but got no answer. The DA's office told us Andy's case is still under review. As for his request for an interpreter, the DA's office says it's up to law enforcement to get statements, not them. Both county agencies question, why doesn't Andy just write a statement? A misconception the deaf constantly encounter.
Writing it down is another issue because sign language is not English. So for most deaf people, you're asking them to write in a foreign language.
My 3 kids were there and they witnessed this whole thing happen. And now my kids are wondering, what is the law going to do for them?
The National Association for the Deaf, which says it's providing Andy with legal representation, told us it is unacceptable for law enforcement officers to communicate only with some people and ignore those who are deaf because their method of communication is different, such as through the use of American Sign Language.
So often what happens when the police come, even if a husband beats up a wife, but they can communicate with the husband, they get the story from that person and not from the victim. And it's an ongoing issue.
Being deaf, Andy says, doesn't mean you don't matter.
I've heard so many stories from deaf people, and that's why I want this to be loud, to shake it up, because we are people too.
Randy Wallace, Fox 26, investigates.